torn whether to dabble in the arts or to do theology. Perhaps because I have always felt that the two disciplines requires two different modes of thought. Of course, both arts and theology require us to be creative. That is, when we communicate our thoughts about God, it helps very much if it is not only solid and clear, but it is also convincingly beautiful, right? But many times, young people keep their distance from creative works, not because they cannot fathom what is before them, but because they are wondering, can this be said in another way? Or in another word? Something a bit more accessible and delightful alike to mortals. It is easy to dismiss this concern by citing this generation or my generation's lack of proficiency and perhaps appreciation for the grandeur of theological discourse. Of course. So, theological literacy as a solution can easily turn into a matter of helping people recognize the voices. Reformed, Wesleyan, Baptist, all the great voices in history, and so that they will be able to join in the conversation. But this is something that only a few will ever have the opportunity to do, right? And so it should not come as a surprise why this generation, my generation, have learned much of its theology instead from music, from movies, and social media. It is not true that people don't have theology just so because they haven't read a page of Calvin's Institutes or they haven't heard of Koyama's Water Buffaloes. It is not true. The truth is, Lucasfilms, the one that gave us the Star Wars series, and Marvel Studios have come up with a better curriculum than any seminary I know in the internet. Why? Because in particular, the Avengers series. The Avengers series ran for a span of 10 years. And what did it do? It nurtured an entire generation, hearts and minds. It was the trinity of Tony Stark, Thor, and Thanos, the snap, that gave a sustained articulation for a lot of young people about the thin line between selfishness and the subtle face of evil, or about how to save the world, or about how individuals can reimagine a future of the present that was unjustly taken from them. If such things are not the thrust of our theological discussions, then Miroslav Volf and Matthew Croasmun was right in saying in their new book, which was released just this year, that theology has lost its way. Let me read what they have written. Again, this is not me, this is Miroslav Volf. When our theology does not provide people with a compelling alternative vision of the good life, it betrays its purpose. This is the tragedy of academic theology today. At the moment when theology's tools are most needed to answer the most pressing questions of our lives and to serve the common good, they are found stuck, dusty, neglected in a corner, even or especially by those people charged with keeping them sharp. Very big words. I can still remember the time when I finished my seminary training. After 5 years of studying about the apostles, the church fathers, the reformers, I realized that such a distinguished life is not for me. That the calling of God for me has more to do with the arts than being a pastor or a professor. So, I'm thinking, what will I do with my degree in theology? I crunch Greek and Hebrew. What will I do with it? When most of my classmates are set in their own fields of church ministry, or even further, deeper, in loftier degrees in theology, I was lost on why God has exiled me in a seminary, only to be set free, not knowing where will I go. Fortunately, a film by Stephen Chow was introduced to me, Shaolin Soccer. The story was about 5 Kung Fu students who was sent out by their master into the modern world and given with a great commandment to make ancient Kung Fu relevant in the modern world. And as you may have guessed, or perhaps remember, some of you have watched the film, the 5 men went out to transform the game of soccer, and in the end of the film, also the way people live their everyday lives. You know what, at that moment when I was watching the film, as if I thought to myself, God has incarnated himself as a Chinese monk and spoke directly to me that I am to go out there and make theology useful in my craft as an artist. So there I was, tapped with a fresh degree that claims to know the fundamental structures of truth and reality, but given a fresh direction in life by a mere work of fiction. At that point, it matters very little to me whether Shaolin, the temple, exists or not, or Kung Fu is real or not. It matters very little to me. I think I would have concurred with what Neil Gaiman once wrote. And he said that fairy tales are more than true. Not because they tell us that dragons exist, but because they tell us that dragons can be slayed. Okay, let me make myself clear. It is not theology that I slayed, okay? But my fear that I would be ranked as among those who have fallen from the graces of full-time ministry. So, because of that, I took the road that has been traversed even less, the path taken by Bezalel and Oholiab. Those 2 names may not be readily familiar with some people, because it is Moses who is often credited to have built the Ark of the Covenant. But these 2 guys are the master craftsmen responsible for executing the very intricate demands of Yahweh in Exodus chapter 25, 31 to 40. We should have invited them here to speak instead of me. So, heeding the advice of R.M. Rilke, wherein it said, test the depths in which your life takes rise. As its source, you will find the answer to the question of whether you must create. Accept it, just as it sounds, without inquiring into it. Perhaps it will turn out that you are called to be an artist. I am called to be an artist. Then take that destiny upon yourself and bear its burden and greatness without ever asking what recompense might come from the outside. I took that to heart. And create, I did. I pursue my passion, like what a happy millennial would, forsaking everything. And I poured out my heart and soul in birthing books and blogs. I sojourned with my fellow millennials in discovering the beauty of a life spent longing for God's kingdom to come on earth as it is in heaven. In writing creative nonfictions, I sought to help my fellow millennials realize that should their faith communities fail to open conversations on how to stop the vicious wheel of injustice in the world, God can use the houses of Westeros. Westeros. Okay, thank you for those who appear. Of course, there have been clarion calls among churches to boycott the acclaimed series, The Game of Thrones, obviously for graphic nudity and very brutal depictions of violence. But not a few of my friends gleefully ignored the warning. They did not read the memo. I think I included myself in that group. To me, it was quite interesting that one of the characters in the series, Daenerys Stormborn, made a more provocative proposal than Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Of course, you are more familiar with Dietrich. The radical German theologian proposed of Christians putting a spoke to halt the wheel of injustice. You must have read that in one of his books. But the young queen in the series inspired an entire army of the unsullied and hordes of viewers from all over the globe that maybe it is not enough to stop the wheel of injustice, because the real challenge is to break it, to destroy it once and for all. And when the final episode of the series did a less than satisfactory turn, you know what? Twitterverse erupted in an uproar. You have their Slavoj Zizek making his own commentary on why it ended up that way. It seems like this generation's interest on a better ordering of society in Westeros and hopefully in our own world was steered quite strongly. Long has been the debate on whether art is a mirror that shows to our face the grim reality of our society, or a hammer that seeks to reshape it. Many conversations on that question. But what I am sure of is this: to be an artist is to believe that a different world is possible, and that there is indeed a different world. And should it be the case that there is no such world, to be an artist in that society is to imagine a world and create that world in people's mind. That's the calling of an artist. Because perhaps more than anyone else, artists know that the world we truly live in is the world that lurks from within. I've always thought of good art as a faint echo of what is eternal. I am convinced that it is one of God's foremost ways of reminding us that every square inch of our world, it can be kind, it can be pure, it can be just, it can be honest, and that it is perfectly all right to think of it that way or even dream of it that way. I think imagining another world is also the task of good theology. Well, as per Matthew Croasmun and Miroslav Volf, it points people to how this world, how its inhabitants, how their patterns of life, and even the very places that they inhabit is meant to be far more beautiful than what is considered as within the realm of possibilities. Arts will have to insist on that. Insist on it. Even if, and perhaps especially if, theology will do otherwise and will happily settle for the peace of having more of the same. Vincent van Gogh, must be familiar with him, did insist on such a world. Or at least he tried to imagine one. Not a few is of the view that Van Gogh's brightly colored paintings, if you have seen one of his works, is actually inspired by his failed venture as a Christian minister. Long before he picked up the brush, it was the Bible that Vincent van Gogh first held in his hands. Way before missional became a catchword in doing authentic ministry, Van Gogh was with coal miners, living with them, and seeing how slowly their lives are being swallowed by the ashes of poverty and misery. Unfortunately, his superiors took his incarnational approach to ministry as necessarily violating and degrading the dignity of a minister. So they kick him out. Severely depressed of this rejection, Van Gogh rechanneled his energy and shifted into the arts. But the thought of giving hope to the coal miners that he once ministered to never left him. He wrote to his brother Theo, "Though I am often in the depths of misery, there is still calmness, pure harmony, and music inside me. I see paintings and drawings in the poorest cottages, in the dirtiest corners. And my mind is driven toward these things with an irresistible momentum." He wrote to his brother, "I don't know anything with certainty, but seeing the stars makes me dream." The body of work left by Van Gogh showcased a fresh approach to capture the streaks of light that shine on his subjects. Interestingly, what could be his most famous painting, Starry Night, this one, features lighted houses of a village in the midst of a deep dark night. That was what the painting is all about. Not a few noticed that the only window without a glimmer of light is that of the church at the center. Notice? Vincent van Gogh must be expressing a very important point. Marcus Borg, not a name I should be mentioning in this August chamber. In a book he wrote on pursuing a more authentic spirituality, made the stark conclusion that compassion is the primary sign of spiritual growth. In fact, Borg is convinced that God's will for us, the work of the Spirit within us, is to turn us into be more compassionate human beings. By compassion, Borg is referring to the capacity to feel the plight of others, or to have the willingness to be present to those in suffering. And Borg argues that the absence or presence of compassion is the central test for discerning whether something is of God. Of course, we would need to counter-check his conclusions with an evangelical commentary, right? So I consulted Richard Dahlstrom. He wrote another book. It was one of the best books in 2011, heralded by Christianity Today, certified evangelical. He wrote a tapestry of riveting stories of people who made creative ways in spilling colors of hope and beauty into the world. Dahlstrom was convinced that as all shades of color derive from three primary colors. What are those? Red, blue, and yellow. Richard Dahlstrom is saying that so is vibrant Christianity or vibrant spirituality. He wrote the multifaceted nature of what God is calling us towards. Like colors, it can be reduced to three primary colors from which all of God's ethics, all of priorities and plans could be derived. God has made it so simple. God has given us three colors to acquire and to nurture. And what are those colors? To seek justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. Every act of beauty derives from a blend of these principles from Micah chapter 6, verse 8. I think Van Gogh, Marcus Borg, and Richard Dahlstrom, three totally different individuals, hit on a very important note shared by most millennials today. If anything, there are those from this generation that say that though they are distancing themselves away from Christianity as a religion and its various institutions, it does not mean that they are also forsaking the state of their own spirituality. Please don't make that hasty conclusion. But the aspect of spirituality they care about centers on how one can make a difference in the way that people treat each other. One can be a very good Christian, but a very bad human. Their spiritual sensibility is closely wired to how membership in a church or identification with Christianity will matter to a world that is slowly being torn apart by indifference and discrimination. This is true whether in social media, very, very toxic social media environment we have now in the Philippines, or in neighboring nation states. As Sir Rico has mentioned, the sea is so big. Some 20 years after writing his award-winning book, What's So Amazing About Grace, Philip Yancey burst on the scene once again, this time with another book, but the title is not so promising. It's now Vanishing Grace. In the book, he made the provocative observation that there are three kinds of people. There are three kinds of people that remain to be the world's chance of ever seeing the face of grace in our world. And you know what? Of these three kinds of people, artists are one of them. And they did not necessarily be Christians, say Philip Yancey. Inasmuch as they speak most authentically to the human condition, their artworks succeed in letting grace be dispensed in the world. Yancey is convinced that while the church may continue to be increasingly ignored by the world that surrounds it, the creative arts remain to be the most compelling path to faith. Why? Because for the simple reason that someone who will never think of setting a foot again in the church will nonetheless and still visit an art museum, watch a movie, or catch a play. In the Philippines, this is actually what happened with Belba Magay's libretto for the zarzuela, Bayan Isang Paanan Lamang. It won the Centennial Literary Award in commemoration of the centenary of the Philippine independence. And it was staged at the main theater of the Cultural Center of the Philippines. And you know what happened? Scores of Christians and non-Christians alike witnessed the important role that deep spirituality played in the country's revolution against Spanish rule. Henry Nouwen notes of a profound mystery in the spiritual life. And he said, many of the events, people, and situations that for a long time seem to inhibit our ways to God become ways of our being united more deeply with Him. What proved to be a hindrance proves to be a gift. So, when young people shape their dispositions toward gender and power or whatsoever, no longer from the apologetics of the pulpit, but from their playlists in Spotify and Netflix, we might as well consider the possibility that creative arts and its many expressions shall serve as the primary sources of this generation's search for spirituality. But this would be a spirituality that is rooted in the realities of the world around them. More than an interest on how to live with a distinctive form of religiosity, today's generation is beset with a concern for building a shared humanity, most especially in societies that keeps pulling its people apart. It won't come as a surprise, or we should not be a surprise, why we will keep on seeing a generation that will drift more and more towards music, movies, and other creative outputs that are marked with a spirituality of generous neighborology. The growing phenomenon of the culture of solidarity built around coffee. Remember, selfie and coffee. It's a very interesting case study. For many millennials, their most deeply held relationships are found no longer when they gather at the communion table, but when they share a cup of coffee, good to honest conversations at a local artisanal cafe. I began by pointing out that arts and theology require different modes of thought. It may be a wonder to theologians how artistic portrayals of the human condition, no matter how authentic, could express the Christian faith, much less probe the depths of Christian spirituality. Let me just end with a quote from Dorothy Sayers. And she said, "Poets have indeed often communicated in their own modes of expression truths identical to the theologian's truths. But just because of the difference in the modes of expression, we often fail to see the identity of the statement."